Going on there, my friends? Welcome to the Fat Man GM's continued revisitation of Iron Crown Enterprises Middle Earth role-playing game system, otherwise known as MERP. This particular guidebook, because that's what they call it, is somewhat confusing to novice MERP enthusiasts, people who don't really catch on. It says it's the second edition of this, and the first edition is kind of tied together with the first edition rulebook. So they didn't create a first version of this, to my knowledge. The second edition is a standalone by itself. I say this over and over again in many of my reviews that one of the things that sets MERP as a game world apart from a lot of other game systems is that it is ubiquitously designed from the get-go. What I mean is they set this thing up to be played using other game system mechanics. It's really easy, and at the beginning of every source book, they give you a subchapter, 2 or 3 pages of conversion charts to allow you to go from the D100 to a D20 system or a D6 system, however you choose. It gives you some base rules for modifying stats and modifiers for a variety of game styles or mechanics. And very few game worlds are created that way with that level of adaptability. This ties over to the older generation of game systems from before I started gaming. So you got to keep in mind that this stuff's been gaming material started in the late '60s. Mid '60s is late '60s. If there's stuff prior to that, I'm not going to say that there isn't, but I've never heard of it. But you go back to stuff like Judges Guild, okay? These were game worlds that were set up to give you all the background material you needed to run a campaign without having to break your back making your own. And in their cases, they were designed to be played with house rules that you made yourself, or through accessing like the old swords and sorcery stuff and the original Rollmaster stuff. We're talking, Gygax is very, very crude earliest versions of Dungeons and Dragons, where the in Iron Crown Enterprises, I don't want to say it was an homage to that sort of mindset, but I think in the very beginning they decided they wanted to create a game system that they knew could be compatible with the more popular systems. And in doing so, this is what makes MERP ageless in that aspect, is you can take any game system mechanics that you're using today that you're a fan favorite of, your Pathfinder, your belchings of a flame princess, or whatever it's called. The mechanics on those could easily be applied to this stuff with a little bit of adapting, not a lot, a little, just a little bit of adapting, and you could set it in a Middle Earth setting. Of course, you wouldn't have the storyline, the world flavor that those game systems created for themselves. Obviously, while they are clones of the standard hack and slash Dungeons and Dragon-ish game system mechanics and style, what sets them apart from each other is the individuality and creativeness of the writers creating their own version or world, so to speak, their own take on that material. It's not hard to take, as I'll use as another older game system that's quite familiar to people in my generation, Shadowrun. Shadowrun is a cyberpunk setting with a fantasy flair. So in that aspect, they took the mechanics and figured out a way to mash a real world shooter with a fantasy hack and slash sorcery magic heavy game system. And it's the mechanics are basically what they needed to cull from this and that and mesh them together so they worked and set it in their world version setting. So in this particular case, the second edition camping and adventuring guidebook, it gives you that information you need to establish Middle Earth as a world for your game system. Now, it doesn't what it doesn't do. Ideally, this if you wanted to run a Middle Earth campaign, world of your own, and you didn't buy any of these prepackaged ICE source books and adventure modules, if you only got your hands on this one book, this would allow you to do it. What it basically contains is all the kernel core information of what makes Middle Earth Middle Earth. Okay, what brought J.R.R. Tolkien's literary work to the gaming world, if you will. So you have climates and weather, indoor, the overview of nations and politics, the line of progression for history and the great events that took place through the various ages, the Second Age, the War of Wrath, leading up to the Third Age, and all the things that took place in those years, including the War of the Ring. So you have all that basic backstory information that's needed as a GM in order to create your own version of this. And then we have the chapter on nations and politics of the wildlands, indoors, inhabitants, the free people. Each one has an entry of the elves, dwarves, hobbits, the humans in their various forms. Having it for an additional set of source material for MERP was why I got it, and it gave you a good reference to a compendium or they compressed all the stuff that they spread all over all the different books into this particular source book, if you will, and it just made it easier for referencing. Although I will acknowledge that at some point in time, this ceased to become as useful as it originally was when I first got it, because I got to know pretty intimately the stuff I needed to know, and I knew where to find it if I needed to polish up on it. They also included things like language in Middle Earth. Now, language is one of those things that most GMs and most players tend to glaze over. I've seen a few campaigns where they were very anal retentive about holding to the concept of the various languages, but the real truth, the majority of players and game masters tend to it's like encumbrance. They have a tendency to do a wink and a nod at it and let it go. So everybody speaks common or Westron or basic or galactic or whatever it is the particular game system wants to use, and this just simplifies things as opposed to going into a bar and having 20 different ethnic backgrounds and sub backgrounds yammering at each other in languages that nobody understands. Although this is why we have comprehend magic or comprehend languages as a spell and as items that allow you to do this. This is another cheat, if you will, because if I can have a necklace of comprehend languages on my neck, I don't have to worry about understanding what everybody's saying. I don't have to worry about the differences of the languages and the issues that can come up. And as a GM, I don't have to struggle with having multiple languages at the table. I don't have to worry about the elves and the humans and the dwarves not being able to communicate well, because it's bulky. It slows things down. So we tend to ignore it. Right, but they have it in here. So the Elvish tongues, Quenya, Sindarin, Sylvan tongue, Elvish writings, Dwarvish, etc., etc., etc. There are times and places where this sort of stuff is important. From the game master perspective, whenever I created a magic user come across a scroll of a new spell they didn't understand, they didn't have. I could easily say, well, it's written in this or it's written in that, so you can't immediately make use of it. That meant they would have to make at least a little effort to decipher what it is. And this is where having those spells or access to the ability of doing things like comprehend languages comes into play, from a different angle, in my opinion, of course. So you can make that decision on your own. And we go into things, the Southern Mannish languages, Orcish, languages in the wildlands, east, south, and north, etc. The use of power. Now, this in a nutshell is where I got my concept of why magic is uh, less dominant in a Middle Earth setting. In any D&D style game system that we have, and all the 100 clones that come since, no matter what you guys want to call them, and all your arguments of how that ain't Dungeons and Dragons, I'll let you have your delusion, but you and I both know that all those game systems that came after Gygax's stuff are just clones of Gygax's stuff and the variations thereof. So, right. The use of power in Middle-earth. Professor Tolkien's histories were intended as a backdrop for a great work on Elvish languages and centered on that part of the world where the Elven tongues saw their most extensive development. The West, close to the Undying Lands and a channel of repository for elves journeying across the sea, was an area of greatest concentration for the firstborn of Middle-earth. It was in limited quarter that Sindarin was developed and Quenya given to the mortal world. Both the Tengwar and the Surth appeared first in the West, thus it was only natural to focus discussions of political and military affairs on this region. In addition, due to their proximity to highly developed elves, then the northwestern section of Middle-earth became quite advanced. Compared to their brethren in other parts of the world, the Edain and the Northmen were technologically superior, generally more literate, and politically organized. The history of the West, then, was the history of those groups who were capable of dominating the entire continent. Discourse concerning events elsewhere was of highly limited value. Now we're talking power. In this case, they're talking political power. But they also tie it into a magic power of constraint and of how it was used and how it's diminished over time. You just have to kind of read in between the lines because to me this all fits together in the same venue or the same vein of thought. The West's unique ties to the Undying Lands also created potential for the appearance and use of significant power, i.e. magic. Such power manifested itself on a massive scale in the First Age and to a lesser and significant degree in the Second Age. By the time of the Third Age, it was quite subtle, except for the case of dragons, the Balrog, Sauron, and of course Saruman, and of course Sauron. This low-key approach to the utilization of great power was a factor relating to the nature of those possessing the gift. The Valar laid down their direct guardianship on Middle-earth in stages. At the end of the First Age, and with the downfall of Numenor, they still kept watch and intervened in the Third Age by sending the Istari, i.e. the wizards, beings who themselves had great power. The Istari, like their masters, did not use force unless it was absolutely necessary to combat darkness, and then only to the degree needed, no more. As a result of this approach, they appeared far weaker than they really were. Other masters of magic employed their abilities in relative secret. Western men and hobbits were not great friends of spells and were often unaware of their usage outside of fairy tales and legends. This created an atmosphere where magical occurrences were rarely seen and often became merged or confused with natural events. Again, the use of power was quite subtle. Tolkien's constant use of nature to illustrate this strength follows this pattern and makes the world he wrote about it all the more believable. Since power in the West versus power elsewhere in Middle-earth. As noted above, the West is somewhat unique. Its history and documents tend to dominate, but those watchful eyes of Valar seem to focus upon the events there. The use of power in the region is naturally colored by those factors. Another vital aspect, however, is the presence of Sauron in Mordor. Sauron is not one to restrain himself when he deems it necessary to act with great authority. He does act cautiously and quietly, especially when nursing himself after a great defeat, but he is capable of unbridled explosions. Those who live under his eye are particularly careful not to cause attention to be brought upon themselves. This feeling may contribute to the restraint found in the elves and the dwarves who possess the ability to wield spells. Some are wary or concerned about upsetting the balance of things, to be sure, but others are doubtlessly afraid. Still others died at the hands of Sauron or others of power. For the bold, those with power often dare to combat those most dangerous. In the east and south, this restraint was not necessarily evident. To begin with, the region itself is relatively wild, and there is a different balance and order. Elves in the east tend to wander and embrace the values of the old ways common before the Valar, and their light affected their kind. Sylvian elves seem to have much more self-centered picture of the world, and their cares differ. As a result, the primary reasons for withholding the utilization of spells have to do with avoiding contact with unfamiliar, unfriendly, or undesirable peoples. So, they didn't go around firing off lightning bolts and fireballs because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. And a great way to draw attention to yourself, particularly the attention of other powerful people who might see you as a rival or a problem, is to go around flinging lightning bolts and fireballs or anybody can see, right? In the case of Gandalf used his magic very carefully, in part because he knew that other members of the Astari and the greater powers could far more easy for them to dictate his movements if he went around firing off lightning bolts everywhere he went. Plus, it was counterdictive to his, I'll call it, his counsel, the way, his need to communicate with the mundane peoples and to influence their actions, especially the ones in charge. So he didn't want to scare the pants off of people like Theoden and Denthor, who obviously knew he had the capability of firing off lightning bolts and fireballs if need be, i.e. he's a wizard after all. But actually doing so and claiming to do so, there's a scene in the movie, in the first movie, when the dwarves show up at Bilbo's home, and one of the dwarves makes a comment about, "Oh, this is dragon." Well, Gandalf's killed many dragons in his life, and the other dwarves like, "Yeah, Gandalf, how many dragons have you killed?" And he's like, "Oh." If he's ever killed a dragon, and I'm not saying Gandalf has or has not killed a dragon, he is not about to sit there and brag about it and tell you that he did. The fact of the matter is, he probably hasn't, unless it was at some point while he was a mayor in service of Valor during the First Age, which at that point is quite plausible that he and a group of others like him took on some fire demons and or dragons and vanquished them in the First Age. Now, we do see a taste of his abilities and powers when he confronts the Bullrog face to face. Out of everybody that's present, the only one that has a chance is him, and eventually he defeats the damn thing at the cost of his persona. Right, he comes back in a new persona, so he's killed in the process of killing the Bullrog. We see that in the big opening pieces of the second movie. Good, which is was a good visual uh, thing to see what was very briefly touched on in the novels. Uh, Power and FRP settings in Miller. The dictomy of the use of the power of Miller affects one's portrayal of its lands and people. When constructing a society in the West, a GM must take great care to show restraint regarding the use of magic. Magic users are relatively rare, although most folk have some magic in them. Often displays of power are even rarer. Elves certainly employ magic in daily life. Dwarves use spells for a variety of reasons, even for producing the wondrous toys. Nonetheless, such enchanting skills are not necessarily the norm. Among hobbits, magic is considered to be the stuff of legends. Men most often tend to feel that way, the same way, and indeed, some have never even heard of its use. In the East or South, however, the depiction of society may include more common occurrences of spell use. Depending on the peoples and their exposure to elves in the day and the concept of conducive to magic users, masters of various forms of power, casting its spells might be quite apparent. The overall political impact on the society may not be great. It does not preclude the use of magic. What holds these people back and has defeated any Eastern or Southern empire from rising is the lack of organization. Where there has been a unity, there has been modest, or Sauron has held sway. Always remember that the West is unique in this, in many other respects. Power in the East and the South manifests itself differently. So basically, I took away from this one piece that to use magic very sparingly to discourage players from taking the sorcerer or magic or the wizard role. And in truth, mostly I prefer that they take it from the sorcerer perspective because we know as a sorcerer this magic's innate, it's internal, it's not required to have huge study and go to all the efforts to being tutored and have access to libraries and so on and so forth. Which in Middle Earth those places would be very few and far between and very closely guarded, very difficult for the average Joe public to decide he wants to be a magic user. Who's going to Who's going to teach him? And are they going to risk what he's potentially capable of turning into if they do? And that leads, tutelage under Sauron's minions, which has its own price. We got our own version of the Jedi and the Sith going on here in Middle Earth, in the light, the dark. So, like I said, integrating Middle-earth to a fantasy role-playing game, the adaptability for other fantasy role-playing systems, FRP, fantasy role-playing, if you didn't catch that, maps and modules and their use, illustrative maps, they give a few good, this also came with a couple color, I think it came with one large version of that map, which I know I had on the wall for years, and I don't know what happened to it. I really don't. So, probably a difficult thing to get your hands on. You might be able to get this on a digital version of this someplace. It's if you're going to play Middle Earth and you're going to use your own game system, or you're going to try to stick to the attitude or flavor that the spirit of Middle Earth as it was intended, having this or some version like it is useful. It's not necessary, but useful. Primarily keeping in mind what I said, the key huge difference here is in very few game systems, pre-generated game worlds, do we have as deep depth history created. And most of those that have that is because the writers and creators of them were big fans of Tolkien's work and or works similar to it. So Tolkien created thousands of years of documented history and adventures and stories, and we have them. This lists, 3 or 4 pages of it as an example, the major key in engagements or in things that took a place down through the ages up to the fourth age. So you set your time in your game system in the beginning of the third age or the middle of the second age. You understand that there's a huge well of history behind the players and a huge well of history ahead of the players, and it's fixed. It's set. They're just small bit players in a grander scheme of things, and nothing they do is going to change the future. It's not going to change it because that's not how this thing works. So that makes for a different kind of mindset when it comes to running a game in a game world of that magnitude. Then there's also the lesser reliance on magic. So if you really want to have a game challenge where magic is very rare and very you're not going to encounter it as much as people would like, and what you do encounter is very subtle. Most of it's, i.e., magic weapons, enhanced items, and things of this nature, or stuff that affect the personal of the person and not the overt effect. So you're more likely to find magic abilities that will enhance your strength or your speed or your skill sets or give you knowledge or things like this, as opposed to being flashy offensive stuff where I'm flinging things at something to eliminate them. So it's a different style and a different take on stuff. Something to consider. If you, as a GM, if you've never played in a game that way, if you've never tried to run a game that way, give it some thought. My reasoning for that is that we've had this discussion with our RPG Brigade channel numerous times about what it takes to become a really good GM, and experience. Experience is the key. Time and experience, failures and successes, but most importantly, experience. Experience in other stuff. Not playing everything the same way with the same set of rules through your entire career, because that makes you a very one horse GM, so to speak, having expanded into different things that are outside your normal comfort zones is a challenge, and not necessarily a bad one because it inspires you to learn new things, but also to look at the old things in a different light. So try running a campaign, and I don't care what setting you choose. Use whatever world or game system you're familiar with, but uh, put the brakes on the magic. Dole it out very slow in very small increments, and you do that across the spectrum. So not only does the players not have much of it, the uh, well, the bad guys don't either. Now, uh, I imagine, and to some degree, and I haven't seen the rule books or the material on it, but the Game of Thrones RPG probably is closest to it. They start out with almost magic being a joke or a myth, and once the dragons are reborn, things start to heat up, so to speak, in a lot of places. So there's an example of that, right? So, like I said, Campaign and Adventure Guidebook, second edition, for Middle Earth. Good luck finding this one on the shelf.